By the time the sun dipped behind the trees at the edge of the quiet town, fear had already taken root in the streets. It was the kind of fear that moved in silence. The kind that crept through alleys and parked itself in locked doors and nervous glances. A black teenager walked home alone that evening, unaware that he was already being watched, studied, and quietly selected as a target by people who thrived on hatred. To them, he was not a son, not a student, not a child with dreams or a future. He was simply a symbol for everything they despised. Their plan was simple. Their confidence was absolute. They believed the town belonged to them, that power flowed only through their bloodlines and twisted traditions. They had hurt others before and faced no real consequences. This time would be no different. Or so they thought. What they did not know, what they could not possibly imagine, was that the boy they marked for destruction carried a legacy far greater than any of them understood. Behind his quiet demeanor and modest life stood a father whose name was spoken in whispers within the most elite circles of the military. A man trained for war, shaped by survival, and forged by sacrifice. A man who had faced enemies far more dangerous than a group of small-town extremists. That night, as shadows stretched across the pavement and engines rumbled in the distance, two worlds moved toward a violent collision. And when they finally met, nothing about this town, this family, or these men would ever be the same again. The town looked ordinary on the surface, the kind of place that appeared quiet on postcards and harmless to outsiders passing through. Tree-lined streets, aging storefronts, a single high school that served every family for miles around. But beneath its calm exterior, the town carried scars that never made it into tourist brochures. Old beliefs lingered in the soil, passed down through generations like heirlooms no one questioned. Some families had lived here for a century. Others had learned over time exactly where they were welcome and where they were not. The teenager walked those streets. Every day with a measured awareness that came from experience. He had grown up, learning how to read the subtle signals of danger, the way some neighbors looked through him instead of at him, the tightening of faces when he entered certain stores, the unnatural silence that followed him in classrooms. He carried himself with quiet discipline, not because he was fearless, but because survival had taught him control. School was his refuge, not because it was free of cruelty, but because it offered structure and purpose. Most of his peers, driven by a determination to rise beyond the limits that seemed pre-written for him. At home, life was simpler in appearance but heavier in meaning. His house stood on the far edge of town, modest and unremarkable, with a yard that was always trimmed and a front porch that never gathered clutter. It was a home built on order. His father lived there quietly when he was not away on long, unexplained absences. The neighbors knew almost nothing about him beyond his reserved nature and disciplined routine. He woke before dawn. He trained alone. He spoke little. To most, he was just another working man who kept to himself. To his son, he was something far more complex. The man who taught him how to stand with confidence in hostile spaces. The man who drilled into him the importance of self-control, awareness, and preparation. The man who never spoke about his past, but whose body carried the evidence of its old scars, rigid discipline, and an unshakable calm that never cracked, even under pressure. The boy did not know the full truth of who his father was. He only knew that his presence made the world feel safer in ways he could not explain. At school, tension followed him in quieter, more calculated forms. Teachers rarely intervened when he was singled out. Certain classmates viewed him as an outsider no matter how high his grades climbed. Rumors followed him like a shadow, spun by people who needed an enemy to feel powerful. He kept his head down, focused on his future, believing that endurance was his greatest weapon. He had learned that reacting to hatred often gave it the fuel it craved. Unbeknownst to him, that same endurance had drawn the wrong kind of attention. On the outskirts of the town, beyond the abandoned warehouses and rusted fences, a group of men gathered regularly in hidden spaces the community pretended not to see. They were bound by a shared history of rage and inherited ideology. Their gatherings were filled with symbols of the past and promises of violence in the future. For them, fear was currency. Control was proof of superiority. They believed that the town belonged to them, and that certain people needed to be reminded of their place. They had been watching the teenager for weeks. They saw him as a threat, not because of anything he had done, but because of what he represented. A young black student excelling in a space they believed should never belong to him. Quiet challenge to everything they had been taught to protect. They studied his routine. They noted the times he walked home alone. They observed who waited with him at the bus stop and who did not. Every detail became a piece in their twisted game. Their confidence came from years of operating without consequence. Complaints had vanished. Victims had moved away. Law enforcement had dismissed incidents as misunderstandings or isolated disputes. The clan had learned that silence kept them safe, that fear did their work for them. And so, emboldened by the town's long history of looking the other way, they decided it was time to make an example again. Meanwhile, the boy remained unaware of the storm building behind him. His days stayed tethered to school assignments, quiet evenings at home, and the familiar rhythm of training with his father in the yard before sunrise. He believed that the danger he faced was limited to what he already saw: hostile looks, whispered insults, subtle attempts to remind him that he was different. He did not know that those looks had evolved into something far more dangerous. His father, however, felt a disturbance he could not fully explain. Years of training had sharpened his instincts to an unnatural degree. He noticed the unfamiliar vehicles lingering at the same corners. He sensed patterns in the boy's schedule that others might dismiss as coincidence. He heard the shift in the town's atmosphere the way a soldier hears changes in the wind before a battle. But he held his silence, watching carefully, waiting for clarity. The night from the hook was now moving steadily closer. Every step the boy took toward home brought him unknowingly closer to a trap set by men who believed power came from hatred. Every quiet evening at the modest house masked the presence of a protector forged in environments far more brutal than the streets of this town. Two worlds were drawing together, one driven by bigotry and arrogance, the other shaped by discipline, sacrifice, and lethal precision. And as the town carried on in its willful blindness, the tension grew tighter with each passing hour, like a wire pulled thin enough to snap at the slightest touch. The following days unfolded with a deceptive normalcy. Morning routines continued. School bells rang. Storefronts opened and closed at their usual hours. To the untrained eye, nothing in the town had changed. But beneath that familiar rhythm, something darker was tightening its grip. The men on the outskirts refined their plan with cold patience. Each night, they studied what they already knew and searched for what they did not. The teenager's routine became their obsession. They mapped his footsteps through the town, tracing every shortcut, every shadowed sidewalk, every stretch of road where no cameras watched and no neighbors lingered. They learned when his father left before dawn and when the house fell silent. They noted the exact moment the boy stepped off the bus in the late afternoon and how long it took him to reach the safety of his porch to them. This was not just an act of violence in the making. It was a ritual, a reminder they believed the town needed, a message they intended to carve into memory. At school, the pressure on the boy subtly intensified. Looks grew bolder. The air around him grew heavier. Passing whispers sharpened into murmurs that carried clear intent. He sensed the hostility rising, but years of conditioning kept him disciplined. He focused on his studies, avoided unnecessary confrontations. He walked faster between classes, sat where exits were closest. These were habits born from experience, not fear. Still, unease followed him like a second shadow. He felt watched. It was not the casual attention he had grown used to. This was different, lingering, predatory. He would look up from a water fountain or a classroom doorway and catch only the retreating end of a stair. In the evenings, as he walked home, he sometimes heard engines slow behind him before speeding away again. Nothing ever fully revealed itself, yet everything felt wrong. He told himself it was only his imagination. He told himself he had endured worse. He told himself that caution had always been his companion, that this feeling was simply part of his life in this town. But his father saw the change. The man had learned long ago that danger announced itself first through patterns, not noise. The boy's posture had shifted subtly but unmistakably. His scanning of surroundings had grown sharper. His answers in the evenings were shorter. His training sessions in the yard had become more intense, driven by an unspoken tension.
Oh.
The father did not ask questions that would alarm him. Instead, he observed, he measured, he calculated. Late at night, when the house was silent, he stepped outside and studied the road. He memorized the sound of every passing vehicle. He noted which ones slowed too much, which returned too often. The town slept. He did not. Elsewhere, the clan's confidence fed on itself. Their belief in their own invincibility had grown with each year they escaped accountability. They spoke of what was coming as if it were inevitable, as if the outcome had already been decided. They imagined fear spreading again through the community like it had before. They took pride in the thought of restoring what they believed to be the natural order of things. They did not plan for resistance as the week progressed. Small incidents began to surface in the boy's paths, subtle acts engineered to test his reactions. A sudden shove in a crowded hallway. Obstructed paths where he once walked freely. Unprovoked hostility that dissolved into forced innocence when authority appeared. Each incident was meant to provoke, to gauge how much he could endure before breaking. He endured in silence, exactly as he always had. What they misinterpreted as weakness was, in truth, restraint. Unseen by all of them, the father's vigilance intensified. He adjusted his schedules. He rerouted his early morning departures. He added precautions the town would never notice. The locks were checked twice. The lights were repositioned. The yard was no longer just a yard. It became a controlled space. Training grew heavier, not in drills, but in awareness. The boy was taught, without explanation, to notice shadows more closely, to trust his instincts without panic, to recognize the difference between coincidence and pursuit. Still, the father did not reveal the full truth. He carried the weight alone, as he always had. Years in war zones had taught him that revealing danger before its shape was clear could cause more harm than good. He would not frighten his son with speculation. He would wait for certainty. That certainty arrived faster than expected. One afternoon, the boy took a slightly later route home after staying behind for extra academic work. The sun dipped lower than usual by the time he stepped off the bus. The streets were quieter. The storefronts were closing. The air felt thicker, heavier, with an unspoken tension he could not place. As he walked, his awareness sharpened. Footsteps echoed too closely behind him once, then disappeared. A vehicle idled at a distance longer than necessary. His pace remained steady. From a distance, far beyond the boy's sight, the first real test of the plan was unfolding. The clan watched from separate positions, communicating silently, moving into alignment with the routine they had memorized. Their patience, honed over weeks, was finally giving way to anticipation. They were close enough now to smell the outcome they craved. What stopped them that day was not mercy. It was timing. An unexpected presence appeared near the boy's route, disrupting the fragile balance they had constructed. The clan scattered before being noticed, dissolving into alleyways and parking lots with the practiced ease of people accustomed to evasion. The boy reached home safely, though unease lingered in his chest long after the door closed behind him. That evening, the father sensed the shift immediately. The boy's silence cut deeper than usual. His movements were sharper, restrained. His eyes held the quiet intensity of someone who had narrowly avoided something without fully understanding what it was. The father did not need confirmation. Instinct had already delivered it. The threat was no longer distant. It was active. From that night on, no moment was left to chance. The father's past, long buried beneath years of secrecy and discipline, began quietly resurfacing in the form of preparations only someone of his background would think to make. Every movement became deliberate. Every sound was analyzed. Every variable was accounted for. The house transformed invisibly. From a modest family residence into a controlled environment of layered security. Meanwhile, the clan's frustration grew. Their failed attempt did not weaken them. The interruption was interpreted as an insult, a challenge to their authority. Their planning grew more aggressive. The margin for error narrowed. They decided the next move would be final. No more tests. No more delays. They selected a night when the town would be distracted by an event that guaranteed empty streets and delayed responders. They organized roles, positions, timing. Each man was given a purpose in the operation they imagined would restore the fear they felt had begun to fade. What they still did not realize was that the house they planned to approach was observed not just by their own eyes. The father had begun to identify patterns that no civilian would notice. Vehicles that returned at irregular but consistent intervals. Footsteps that lingered too long in darkness. Signals that might have passed as coincidence to anyone else. To him, they formed a mosaic of intent. He did not confront them. He did not alert the town. He prepared the boy, unaware of the scale of what surrounded him. Simply believed that his father's intensity had increased without explanation. Training sessions were longer now. Awareness drills were constant. The father spoke often of caution, of discipline, of trusting instinct above all else. The boy listened, as he always had, unaware that the skills being pushed into him were not theoretical. The night the clan had chosen drew closer. Tension thickened in the air around the town like storm. Clouds building pressure before a lightning strike. Neighbors sensed unease without understanding it. Dogs barked more often. Engines seemed louder at night. The boy's route grew quieter, emptier. On the final evening before everything would change, the teenager walked home beneath a sky streaked with deepening red and purple. He felt the familiar weight of eyes on his back once again. This time, it did not fade. It followed him. From a hidden distance, the clan moved into position, and from inside a quiet house at the edge of town, a father watched the darkness with the patience of a man who had survived far worse than what now crept toward his doorstep. The wire had been pulled to its absolute limit. All that remained was the snap. The snap came without warning. The evening fell into an uneasy stillness as the last stretch of daylight bled from the sky. The town's distant noise softened under the weight of night, placed by long shadows and the constant hum of insects hidden in tall grass. The teenager stepped off the bus and began the final walk toward home. His senses unusually alert, his heartbeat steady but heavy. The road ahead stretched empty. The road behind him felt crowded with invisible presence. From the outskirts, the clan closed in. They moved with calculated intent, their vehicles darkened, their footsteps swallowed by the distance between streetlights. They had chosen their moment carefully, believing every variable was under their control. The street was quiet. The neighbors were occupied. The house sat isolated at the far edge of the town just as they had studied for weeks. To them, it looked like the perfect final stage. What? They did not see were the eyes already tracking their approach long before. The boy reached the first shadow of his yard. The father had been waiting. He felt the disturbance in the air before any sound reached him. Years of survival in hostile environments had conditioned him to sense danger as a physical pressure, not a concept. The subtle vibration of distant engines, the unnatural silence between cricket songs, the energy shift that signaled movement with intent. He moved without hesitation, positioning himself where the street met the unseen perimeter. He had already mapped in his mind. The boy slowed as a vehicle rolled too. Close behind him, the moment stretched. Then, everything erupted at once. The vehicle surged forward. Dark shapes poured from its sides with sudden speed. The quiet street shattered under the noise of rushing footsteps and aggressive movement. The attack had begun. The teenager reacted on instinct before understanding fully what was happening. Years of subtle conditioning, of awareness, of restraint, transformed into immediate survival. He ran for the yard, his lungs burning as shadows lunged from behind. The distance to the porch felt impossibly long. The world narrowed to motion, breath, and the pounding of his own heartbeat before the attackers could close the final gap. The yard exploded with motion of its own. The father moved like a force released from confinement. He emerged from darkness, not as a frightened parent, but as a calculated presence. It's precise and devastating. Each step was deliberate. Each movement was controlled. He placed himself between the boy and the advancing figures with an authority that halted their momentum for a split second, a mistake that would cost them dearly. Instinct overrode their hesitation, and they advanced anyway. What followed was not chaos. It was domination. The father intercepted the first wave with speed that defied perception, redirecting force with lethal efficiency. Every movement stripped an attacker of their confidence in seconds. The discipline forged in battlefields far from this town now unfolded with terrifying clarity. The yard became a controlled zone of engagement, each step chosen for terrain. Each response executed with devastating restraint. Weapons were neutralized before they could fully rise. Bodies fell before they understood why. The attackers had come, prepared to inflict fear. They were not prepared to face a professional who had made a career of defeating men far more trained and far more dangerous than they were. The teenager reached the porch just as the clash reached its peak. He turned in time to witness the transformation of his father from quiet guardian to living force. The man he had known as disciplined and distant now moved with a precision that felt unreal, his presence filling the space with a dominance that broke the attacker's coordination entirely. Panic spread through them where certainty once lived. Their numbers, once a source of confidence, became an obstacle to each other. Their rehearsed plan collapsed under the weight of rapid losses. The ideology that had fueled them for years provided no shield against skill, awareness, and resolve forged through real war. One by one, they attempted to retreat. The father did not chase recklessly. He advanced just enough to ensure the threat collapsed in full. Each attempt to flee was met with surgical restraint, not vengeance, not rage. Control. Vehicles roared to life in desperate retreat. Tires screamed against pavement. The clan scattered into the dark with fear, now burning in their own veins. Their sense of invincibility shattered in moments. Silence followed. It was not the peaceful silence of safety, but the heavy stillness that settles after violence has spent its force. The yard stood marked by the evidence of what had just unfolded. The street beyond remained empty, as if the town itself had turned away at the final moment. The father stood still at the center of it all, his breathing slow and steady, scanning the darkness with unbroken focus. Only when he was absolutely certain the threat had withdrawn did his posture shift. Only then did the weight of parenthood return to his shoulders. The boy watched from the porch, frozen between fear and disbelief. The truth, long hidden behind quiet discipline and unanswered absences, had just torn through the night without explanation. Everything he thought he understood about his world had been violently rearranged in a single encounter. The man who taught him restraint had revealed origins shaped by something far beyond the boundaries of this town. Emergency lights began to bloom in the distance. Neighbors would later claim they heard nothing. Others would say they heard everything. Official explanations would be incomplete, softened, carefully shaped to fit narratives that made the town more comfortable. But comfort was already gone. The boy was finally pulled inside the house, the door closing behind them with a weight that felt permanent. The yard, moments earlier a battlefield, fell back into deceptive quiet. Inside, the house felt different now. The air was thick with revelations too heavy for words. The boundaries between past and present had collapsed. The boy no longer saw just a father. He saw an unknown history written in muscle memory and survival instinct. He saw answers he had never thought to ask. Outside, the clan retreated with shattered confidence. Their belief in unchecked dominance had met a force that did not recognize hatred as power. Their carefully maintained myth of control had been dismantled in a space of minutes. For the first time in their long history of intimidation, they were the ones fleeing into darkness without protection. The town would wake to rumors instead of truth, whispers of violence, half-seen shadows, distorted accounts shaped by fear and denial. But beneath the surface noise, far deeper reality had been established. The wire had not only snapped, it had been cut clean through, and nothing that followed would ever unfold the same. Way again, morning arrived without ceremony. The sun rose over the same rooftops. Same storefronts, the same streets that had carried generations of quiet prejudice beneath their surface. To anyone passing through, the town still looked unchanged. But those who lived there felt the shift immediately. Something fundamental had been disrupted in the night. A balance built on fear had cracked. News traveled in fragments. Some spoke of shadows moving through the outskirts. Others whispered about emergency vehicles seen too late to explain anything clearly. A few claimed to have heard distant chaos, but could not place its source. As always, the town reached for the comfort of uncertainty. In the absence of official clarity, rumor became truth, and silence once again tried to bury reality. The house at the edge of town remained closed that morning. Inside, life moved with a careful stillness. The teenager sat with a weight he had never carried before, not only fear, but understanding. The world he had grown up navigating with quiet endurance now looked different. The danger he had always felt had taken form. The invisible lines he had learned to walk so carefully had been enforced not just by social hostility, but by real violence waiting for opportunity, and his father was no longer just a distant figure of discipline. The man he had always known as controlled and reserved now stood fully revealed, not through explanation, but through what he had done. The truth of his past did not need words. It lived in the precision of his movements, in the calm that had dominated chaos, in the way he had stepped into harm's path without hesitation. The boy understood now that the warnings, the training, the discipline had never been abstract. They had been survival passed quietly from one generation to the next. That knowledge changed him. Fear still existed. But it no longer stood alone. It was joined by awareness, by clarity, by the understanding that the hatred he had endured was not passive, not accidental, and not harmless. It was organized. It was deliberate. And it had just failed. Across town, the clan fractured in silence. Those who had fled into the darkness did not return with their confidence intact. Their sense of untouchable power had been dismantled in the very act meant to reinforce it. For years they had relied on anonymity, on the town's reluctance to see, on victims retreating instead of resisting. None of those patterns had held. For the first time, they had met resistance they could not intimidate. The retreat did not bring triumph. It brought fear. Their secrecy felt thinner. Their movements felt watched. The belief that the town would always protect them through indifference was no longer certain. The night had taken something from them they could not easily claim. The wider community responded with familiar contradictions. Some residents dismissed the rumors as exaggeration, desperate to preserve the illusion of peace. Others quietly reevaluated what they had long chosen not to see. A few felt an unspoken relief that something had finally disrupted the pattern, even if they did not yet understand what that meant. But change in such a town never arrived loudly. It moved slowly, reluctantly, pushed by events rather than embraced by intention. The night's violence became an uncomfortable subject, referenced only in half-statements and nervous glances. Yet beneath the surface, its impact spread wider than anyone could measure. At school, the air shifted. The teenager returned to the same hallways, the same desks, the same daily routines. Outwardly, nothing dramatic followed. Inwardly, everything had changed. The glances he received carried uncertainty instead of certainty. The whispers lost some of their confidence. The subtle intimidation that had once followed him so easily now hesitated at the edges of perception. Fear had changed direction. He still walked carefully, still kept his awareness sharp, but he no longer walked alone in the way he once had. The burden of silent endurance was now shared with the knowledge that protection had teeth, that survival was not the same as submission. At home, discipline remained. The father did not become louder, did not grow more expressive. His vigilance continued as it always had, quiet, relentless, precise. But something unspoken had settled between them now, a truth that did not need constant repetition. The boy trained with a deeper understanding of why every movement mattered. The father watched with a sharper purpose, not as a man preparing for abstract danger, but as one who knew exactly how real it could become. The night had not ended the threat. It had exposed it. Hatred does not disappear when it is confronted. It adapts. It waits. It reshapes itself inside silence and denial. The difference now was that the boy no longer moved through that silence unaware. He understood the weight of what surrounded him, and he understood that endurance alone was not always enough. Neither was violence. The true shift did not come from the clash itself. It came from what followed the dismantling of certainty on both sides. The attackers had learned that intimidation was not invincibility. The victim had learned that survival did not have to mean invisibility, and the town had been forced, however quietly, to confront the fact that the danger it ignored had never been imaginary. In the weeks that followed, subtle consequences unfolded. Certain gatherings on the outskirts ceased. Familiar vehicles no longer lingered where they once had. People who had moved with arrogant confidence now moved with caution. Fear had not vanished from the town, it had redistributed. For the teenager, life continued forward. He still chased his future through education and discipline. He still carried the weight of being different in a place that resisted difference. But now, beneath the pressure, lived a deeper resolve. Had seen what hatred could become when left unchecked. Had seen what protection truly meant when it stepped out of the shadows. He no longer measured himself solely by how quietly he could endure. He measured himself by how firmly he could stand. The night at the edge of town became a quiet marker in his memory, not a story of revenge, not a legend of violence, but a turning point. The moment when threat met consequence. The moment when silence fractured under the weight of truth. And in that fracture, something lasting had formed. A reminder that hatred, no matter how old or organized, is ultimately built on the belief that its targets will always remain unprotected. The moment that belief is broken, the entire structure begins to collapse. The town would take years to truly change, if it ever did, but one truth had already taken root. Power had shifted not because of numbers, not because of noise, but because someone had finally stood where fear expected no resistance, and the boy who once walked home believing endurance was his only shield now carried a deeper lesson into every step he took forward. That survival is not just about making it through the darkness. It is about proving, without words, that the darkness does not own you, and for every quiet town still pretending not to see the hatred in its streets, the question remains: how many nights pass in silence before someone is finally forced to confront what they chose to ignore?